What if I told you that just 100 Filipino men, outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off, stood their ground against thousands? They weren't fearless, they were human, exhausted, wounded, and afraid, but in their eyes burned something stronger than fear, the refusal to give in. Surrounded on all sides, deep in unforgiving terrain, there was no backup coming, no escape waiting, just silence, pressure, and the certainty that they were alone. Night fell, and still they held their position, gripping their weapons, listening to every sound in the darkness, knowing the next attack could come at any second. And then it did, waves upon waves of enemy forces advancing, their numbers stretching beyond sight, an overwhelming force that should have ended everything. But instead of breaking, the Filipino soldiers stood firmer, digging deep, planting their feet, choosing defiance over surrender in the face of impossible odds. Even their enemies began to hesitate, watching in disbelief as this small group refused to collapse, refused to run, refused to surrender. Because this wasn't just a battle, it was something greater, a last stand that would echo far beyond that battlefield, the story of 100 Filipinos versus thousands, and the stand no one expected. The air was thick with tension long before the first shot was fired, hanging heavy over a rugged, unforgiving landscape. Deep within that harsh terrain, a small Filipino unit stood alert, watching as enemy forces stretched endlessly across the horizon. They were completely isolated, cut off from reinforcements and surrounded on all sides, with no clear way out. These weren't elite super soldiers with advanced equipment, but ordinary Filipino men, farmers, laborers, and young recruits. Their supplies were running dangerously low, and their ammunition was limited, every bullet now carrying weight. In silence, they prepared themselves, tightening their grip on their weapons, bracing for what was coming next. Because behind them were the people they had sworn to protect, their homes, their families, their future. And ahead of them, an overwhelming force of thousands, closing in with one clear objective: to wipe them out. At first, the enemy didn't even take them seriously, watching from a distance with confidence, convinced this would be an easy win. Reports came in describing just a small Filipino group, barely a company, an easy target, a quick victory waiting to happen. So the first wave advanced, moving forward with overwhelming numbers, expecting little to no resistance. But something unexpected happened. The Filipinos didn't break, didn't scatter, and didn't panic under pressure. Instead, they held their ground, each Filipino soldier steady and focused, responding with calm precision. Every shot was deliberate, every movement calculated. They fought with discipline far beyond what anyone anticipated. What unfolded wasn't just resistance, it was something greater, a force of purpose that made them seem larger than their numbers. And as the first attackers fell back, confusion began to spread among the thousands, their certainty suddenly shaken. The terrain became their greatest weapon, and the Filipino soldiers understood it better than anyone else. They knew every inch of the land, every ridge, every tree line, every narrow path that could turn movement into a deadly trap. As the enemy pushed forward in large numbers, they were funneled into tight spaces the Filipinos had already mastered. While the enemy relied on sheer numbers, the Filipino defenders relied on precision, turning natural cover into near-impenetrable fortresses. They moved silently between positions, appearing and disappearing like shadows, striking without warning. And with every failed advance, the psychological tide began to shift. What was meant to be a quick victory was becoming something far more dangerous, an embarrassment. But the real turning point came when night fell, and under the cover of darkness, the thousands prepared for a decisive push. They moved forward with confidence, believing that sheer force and the confusion of night would finally overwhelm the defenders. But they underestimated one thing: the Filipino soldiers weren't afraid of the dark, they used it. As the attackers advanced, they were suddenly met with bursts of fire from unseen Filipino positions hidden in the shadows. The battlefield erupted into chaos, orders lost in the noise, units colliding, confusion spreading in every direction. And in the middle of it all, those 100 Filipino defenders fought with such intensity that it felt like they were everywhere at once. Hours turned into days, and across the unforgiving terrain, the Filipino defensive line still held firm. Supplies dwindled further as exhaustion set in, some Filipino defenders injured, others pushed far beyond their limit. But something deeper kept them going, a shared understanding that if they fell, everything behind them would fall too. They began to ration ammunition carefully, each Filipino soldier aware that every remaining bullet mattered. Every shot became a decision, each target chosen with precision, knowing every move could mean life or death on that terrain. And even in those brutal conditions, the Filipino defenders refused to give up their position, holding the line no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the enemy grew frustrated, their confidence beginning to crack as they struggled to understand how such a small Filipino force could hold them back. Reinforcements were called in, and more troops began arriving across the harsh terrain, swelling their numbers even further. Soon, the battlefield was filled with an even larger force, stretching across the terrain, but still facing the same small Filipino defensive line. And yet, the result remained unchanged. Every attempt to break through was met with unwavering resistance from the Filipino defenders. Wave after wave crashed against their position, but the line held firm, refusing to bend under pressure. That's when the enemy commanders began to realize something unsettling. This was no longer just a battle, it had become a test of will, and the Filipinos were refusing to lose. Inside the Filipino defensive lines on that unforgiving terrain, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Food was nearly gone, and the soldiers rationed what little remained, each portion a reminder of how close they were to running out. Water was scarce, and exhaustion weighed heavily on every Filipino defender as the harsh terrain offered no relief. Communication with the outside world had completely collapsed, leaving them isolated with no way of knowing if anyone even knew they were still alive. And yet, when the question of surrender was raised, it was met with silence, followed by a quiet but firm, collective refusal. They didn't need to say it out loud, it was understood across the line. They would hold their position on that terrain, no matter the cost. The next assault was the largest yet, with thousands advancing across the terrain in coordinated waves, determined to crush the Filipino defenders once and for all. The ground shook as they moved forward, their sheer numbers turning the terrain into a storm of motion and sound. From a distance, it looked completely unstoppable, an overwhelming force rolling toward a small Filipino defensive line. But as they closed in, the same pattern repeated itself. The Filipino defenders struck with precision, using every advantage the terrain gave them. Slowly, almost unbelievably, the massive advance began to stall, its momentum fading under relentless resistance. Then it stopped, and then it broke, as the enemy forces collapsed and retreated across the terrain while the Filipino line held firm. What made this stand so extraordinary wasn't just the numbers, it was the mindset, as the Filipino defenders held their ground on that unforgiving terrain with quiet determination. They weren't fighting for glory or recognition. In fact, many believed they wouldn't survive, yet they stood firm anyway. Because to them, the line they held on that terrain wasn't just a position on a map, it was the boundary between safety and destruction for the people behind them. And that belief transformed those 100 Filipino defenders into something far greater than their numbers could ever suggest. As the days dragged on across the harsh terrain, stories began to spread, even among the enemy, whispers of Filipino defenders who simply refused to break. They spoke of an unbreakable force on that terrain, a line that held no matter the odds, no matter the pressure. Slowly, morale began to shift. Doubt crept into the minds of the enemy as they faced the relentless Filipino resistance. And for the first time, the thousands hesitated on that terrain, questioning whether victory was even possible, because how do you defeat an enemy that refuses to accept defeat? Then, something unexpected happened. Across the rugged terrain, Filipino reinforcements long thought impossible began to arrive. They weren't overwhelming in number, but their presence was enough to change everything, bringing renewed strength to the Filipino defenders on that terrain. For the first time since the battle began, the defenders were no longer alone, as the reinforced Filipino line stood stronger across the terrain. And when the enemy realized this, the momentum shifted completely. What had once seemed like an easy victory had become a prolonged, costly struggle they could no longer justify. The retreat wasn't immediate. It came slowly, reluctantly, as the once confident enemy began to pull back across the terrain, step by step. They left behind a battlefield that told the story of what had happened there, scarred terrain, scattered remnants, and the cost of every failed advance. And at the center of it all stood the Filipino survivors, the 100 who had refused to give up, still holding their ground on that unforgiving terrain. When it was over, the scale of what the Filipino defenders had done became clear. Outnumbered beyond reason, cut off from support and running on empty, yet still standing across that battered terrain. They had held the line not because they had to, but because they chose to, and that choice defined everything. And in the end, that decision turned what should have been a forgotten moment into a story that would echo far beyond that terrain, carried by the legacy of those Filipino defenders. So the next time someone tells you that numbers are everything, remember this story. Remember the 100 Filipino defenders who stood against thousands on that unforgiving terrain and didn't back down. Because sometimes it's not about how many you have, it's about how far you're willing to go. So if this story gave you chills, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And as the sun rises over that battlefield terrain, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unbelievable stories. Because history is full of moments like these, you just have to know where to look.